John's. It's yours. Do you read this?
Good boy. Watch out, Tom. I'm fortunately short enough that I actually don't.
Okay.
I don't come to it, but I can see how for a man of your
towering
stature.
presence in the industry.
Stop. That makes me think of my friend Tom French. Used to work at this at. He was on Solitude, and he showed us the Baby Killer Pip-Boy thing. You guys ever seen?
Oh, yes, it's fantastic.
With him kicking the pregnant woman in the stomach. Unfortunately, did not get into the game.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure Brian Menzies still has them. Yeah, I'm pretty sure Brian Menzies still has all that. Is that right? On his computer somewhere. I mean,
Okay, so let me get your guys' names. I know I met you last night. Remind me.
Sure. Travis Stout.
Travis Stout.
I'm Eric Finstermaker.
Finstermaker.
Yeah.
So you're a designer and you are
Also a designer.
Yeah. Also a designer. I may have to glance at your
Cool. I'll hold up.
We'll also be doing a thing where we introduce ourselves during. So I've got.
Maybe I'll just say John and the boys from Obsidian.
Eric Finstermaker.
Nice.
They have names.
They have names.
We get it.
No, that's cool. No, I didn't realize it was going to be a panel, but that's true.
Well, it was going to be originally going to be Chris Avalon and myself and George Sykes, and they had to drop out because they're working on a tight deadline.
And I guess I assumed you were going to be doing it alone.
I mean, the presentation is more or less solo, but they'll be adding in and also helping out with questions and answers.
Okay.
Because I think at least, I'd say the timing is we're going to try for similar timing to what Joseph Staten is doing.
Okay.
Where we take a lot of questions.
Okay, that's fine. Entirely up to you. Let's see. Co-opt your platform here for just a second. So I hate early in the day because I have so many things I have to announce, to remember to announce, and all that kind of stuff.
Hey, how far from this microphone?
Generally, I think you need to get pretty close.
Okay.
That's been my impression. I mean, I know when Greg Kasavin was doing his yesterday, I was worried that people weren't hearing him because he was about as far away as Travis is.
All right.
And
yeah,
a lot of times he was pretty soft, and I was just sitting right down there. So,
yeah. Okay.
Yeah, don't be afraid to get up on it.
Okay.
It's 11:01. Let's do it. Hi there. Let's get rolling. Welcome again. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Tom Abernathy, writer at Microsoft Game Studios and advisory board member for the 2010 Game Narrative Summit with Lev Chapelsky and Richard Dansky. Just a couple of program notes before we turn it over to our speakers. In the room down the hall, not that you care because you're not there, but Jeff Spock is talking about 4D world building. At noon, the poster competition session is going to be happening. You may have noticed the posters all already set up in the hallway out there. They're really cool. Students from game development programs all over the country have made them up. They're sort of like book reports for games, if you will, and they blow them up to poster size, and there's a little competition, and the winners have been chosen, but all the stuff out there is terrific. So by all means, take a look at that. Also, during lunch, Emily Short and Clara Fernandez-Vara, who's waving right there, are going to be in the hallway talking about how to play interactive fiction. So drop by their table and converse with them. After lunch, 1:30, in this room, Kevin Brooks will be talking about the power of traditional storytelling in new platforms. In room 7 will be the new writers Q&A with Chris Metzen et al. At 3 o'clock in this room, the creators of Transmedia Stories panel will be here in this room. And down the hall, Jeremy Bernstein will be talking about narrative mechanics, an approach to crafting emotion in games. 4:30 in this room, Flint Dilley, Transmedia, the new vanguard of fiction. And down the hall in room 7, Writing for Social Games, or How I Stopped Worrying and Learned to Love Data Mining. I love that title, by James Portnow. And the WGA Game Narrative Summit Mixer at 5:30, which will be in the lobby outside room 7. And the on the GDC Online opening night party tonight at Maggie Mae's on 6th Street, 7 to 10 p.m. Whew, I think I got all that. Our speakers today come to us from Obsidian Entertainment. Mr. John Gonzalez is creative lead designer down there. Mr. Eric Finstermaker is designer, and Mr. Travis Stout is designer. And they are here to talk about narrative design between the lines. They're a great group of folks, and it's a fantastic studio. So I can't wait to hear what they have to say. Without further ado, give them a round.
Good morning, everyone. Pleasure to be here. I imagine that you can hear my booming voice just fine, right? Okay, very well. Well, if you're in this room, you came here for a session entitled Narrative Design Between the Lines, Game Development Conversation Standards. But the honest truth is that that was what it was titled when there were going to be 3 lead creative designers here, 2 of whom are unable to attend because of the pressing deadlines on the projects that they were going to talk about. So you're going to have me, and you're going to have 2 other people from Fallout New Vegas. So everything here is going to be focused on our experience in developing Fallout New Vegas, and therefore will be informally retitled Surviving the Apocalypse, the writing of Fallout New Vegas. So who are we? Well, as Tom was just mentioning, I am John Gonzalez. I'm the lead creative designer and lead writer of Fallout New Vegas. And we have 2 other staff members here who are also writers and area designers on the project. And I'll let each of them introduce themselves in turn. First of all, Eric.
Hi, everybody.
One of his main virtues is concision. And also Travis Stout.
I feel like my whole life is up there on that screen.
So, actually, it would be more accurate to say that we worked on the game because it is done and will be releasing on October 19th. Very well. I hope you enjoy it. So, today's subject, what will we be covering today? The narrative design process with an emphasis on process. By that, what I mean to say is that I'll be talking about the narrative design process from the very beginning, the generalities, I guess you could say, of blue sky concepting during pre-production, and drilling down into some fairly nitty-gritty bits about the actual writing of the project. And I'll be making examples of a lot of sample design documents, which in most audiences I think would be a very risky thing to do, but because of the narrative design focus of the summit, I felt like I could probably get away with that. And then we will also be taking questions. I'm only planning to speak for about half of the time slot, and then at that time we'll entertain your questions. I will also entertain any questions if they just arise during the presentation. If there's something in particular you want to ask about, just raise your hand. All right. So, a little personal prologue, how it was that I became involved in Fallout New Vegas and what that experience was like for me. So, February 12th, 2009 is a day that I'll never forget because it is on that day that Fergus Urquhart, who's the CEO of Obsidian Entertainment and who, despite his ostentatiously Scottish name, does not wear a kilt around the office or play the bagpipes, and so far as I know has always been kind to sheep, comes into my office and he says these words: "Okay, so you'll be creative lead on the next Fallout." And so what I said to Fergus was probably something along the lines of, "Very, very good, sir. That sounds fine." But what I was thinking was something else. And I was actually thinking this in both ways that you can possibly imagine it. One of it was just the fist pumping kind of like really happy, like, holy shit, I get to be, the lead creative designer of the next Fallout. This is amazing. But also the kind of desire to just hide under one's desk and tremble before the enormity of the task at hand. So it was kind of both of those things. Because, I don't know about you, but the first 2 titles in this franchise were, just like Hallmark games for me. They were games that really opened my eyes to the narrative possibilities of this medium. I played them very extensively. And one of the main reasons that I was interested in joining Obsidian is that it was founded and has retained several key staff members from Black Isle Studios that had done the first 2 games. And then there's this bad boy that was released in October of 2008 that went on to, it still has a Metacritic average of above 90% and has sold millions of copies. And I was extremely excited about this title. I was literally the first person in line at the midnight launch at the GameStop on Washtenaw Avenue in Ann Arbor, Michigan, in order to pick this up. I've been devouring every single game video. I mean, I was very, very excited about this title, and so all of a sudden I find out that I'm going to be participating in this franchise. So, no pressure, no big deal. For me, it was kind of as though God had come down and just thrown the Bible at me and said, hey, why don't you go ahead and write another chapter to this and just take it in whatever direction you want and see what you come up with. So where do you start from there? Well, the really good thing about Obsidian is Obsidian places extraordinary value on storytelling and writing, and so there is a process. There was a kind of direction to swim in. And I think that this is a direction that everyone here who writes will probably recognize. The first one is inspiration, or as you might also call it, research. So the first thing was to play the other games. I played through the first two games, and they actually hold up remarkably well. There are some things about them that, of course, seem primitive by today's standards, but they're fantastic games. And then also, I had already played about 60 hours of Fallout 3, but I just sort of dived back in using the rather maniacally conceived game guide that had been put together and played a lot of the other side content, really familiarized myself with that. But then beyond that, we also assembled a library of reference films to watch in order to immerse ourselves in the ambiance of Fallout. And also Las Vegas. That was another thing that was obviously going to be extraordinarily important for our title. And in particular, I would say Ocean's 11 was probably the signature film, as far as I was concerned, the original version. Because there's really some fantastic dialogue in that game that was rather in that film that was an inspiration in particular for one of the tribes or families on the Strip that you'll have a chance to encounter. And also, we had a library of books to read, reference books, again to sort of soak up the atmosphere and the ambiance. And fiction was important, but I would say that even more important was nonfiction. And this is one of the things I would recommend to anyone who's embarking on a large project, no matter. Even if you're working in very traditional fantasy or traditional science fiction, I really think that researching nonfiction and nonfiction stories is a stronger place to begin in many ways. For one thing, it'll be less derivative, but you'll just uncover an incredible kind of wealth of stories that will inspire content for the game. The first title here, the Las Vegas and Unconventional History, was an especially important piece as a fantastic kind of introduction to the city of Las Vegas. It is just stock full of photos from every single era of the city. The Greenfeld Jungle was a landmark expose, I think around 1970, that revealed to the public just how mobbed up Vegas was. And in the far corner here, we have the Time Life Library on the Old West, which was also important, kind of interesting to page through, get a lot of inspiration from images in there that all had to do with the Western setting of the game. So, having taken in all of that, having played and watched and read, and sort of assembling this gumbo in your head, one of the so that at that point we were reacquainted with the unique kind of world of tomorrow that has gone very wrong with an atomic apocalypse of the game, and also had been able to define what would be the landmark features. So one thing was a signature city. One thing that I think Fallout 3 did very well was choosing to set itself in Washington, D.C. And it was able to do that at a time when we finally had the technology in order to carry that off convincingly. If you look at Fallout 1 or 2, it would have been very difficult for them to focus on a large urban area. So Las Vegas was going to be that for us. Then, of course, open world exploration. That was something that we were going to be retaining from all of the series, all of the installments in the series. And that has a lot of implications. Because if you're going to be creating a game that somebody could be playing for 40 hours to 100 hours or even more, And if they're going to be able to go anywhere and do anything pretty much whenever they want, you have to just say goodbye to authorial control. This is not going to be that kind of storytelling. This is not going to be about your story. It's going to be about creating a kind of possibility space for the player and stocking it with interesting characters and conflicts and choices. And so that, as I said, a lot of implications to that. Other things that we, as a studio, were committed to emphasizing was reactivity to your character, both in terms of bringing back the reputation system that had been a hallmark of the first two installments of the game, and also making sure that characters in dialogue and also outside of dialogue, there was a lot of reactivity to your abilities, your skills, and also unique perks that your character has. Multiple quest solutions has also been another hallmark of the series and something that we wanted to emphasize. Also to the extreme in our case, we went actually much farther than Fallout 3 in that we have a game in which you can kill nobody. You can kind of go through and play it as a speechifying pacifist, or you can kill everybody. And that is very difficult to write for, because what it means is you cannot count on the player ever talking to the person that you want them to speak to and getting content in that fashion, because that player may be, in essence, a walking flamethrower that torches everything within 100 yards of, just on sight. So, for example, you can go ahead and set up, you can kind of carefully script first encounters with some key NPCs so that when the player kind of walks into an area, you force a conversation before they can kill them, and then they can kill them right after. Or the other thing that we did in one case is there is one NPC who's unkillable in the game, but it's in a very, it's in a completely kind of natural way. It is something that's endogenous to the fiction of the game. But I'll go ahead and let you meet that NPC when you play. And finally, we also had a focus on companions. This is something that the studio at Obsidian has done a really remarkable job of throughout all of its titles, and that was something that we wanted to emphasize. There were companions in Fallout 3, but once you met them, they didn't really have a story. They just kind of added firepower to your character. And in our game, each of those characters have narrative arcs that you can pursue. That's something that maybe also Eric and Travis can talk a little bit more about during the question and answer, because both of them wrote two of the companions for the game. And one other thing that I think probably belongs on this slide that isn't there was that another thing that we understood as we were going into this is we were going to be using an established tool set. We were going to be using the Garden of Eden creation kit that Bethesda had used to develop Fallout 3. And that was very important because it was something that was going to guide a lot of the ways that we would tell stories. For example, we knew that when you had conversations with characters, we weren't going to be cutting the point of view from multiple characters like in a game like Mass Effect or some of the other BioWare games. You're going to have a pretty limited view of that character. You're talking to one person at a time. The expressivity of that character is fairly limited. You can kind of trigger some animations, but there's really no kind of nonverbal expression that you can count on, especially from the player who's never even seen. And you have to make sure that you're then going to pitch the storytelling to the strengths and avoiding the weaknesses of that primary storytelling technique. But we also, of course, used a lot of audio logs and text logs, things that are typical. So that understanding emerged, but another thing that emerged from this reference and research phase was also just a lot of rich material about Las Vegas. And none of this has a one-to-one correspondence in the game. It's all things that inspired content. But some things that I would just emphasize would be, Vegas Vic, the mascot of Las Vegas, was something that is sort of interesting about Fremont Street and about the history of the city. The Rat Pack was very much the era that we were trying to harken back to in the same way that Fallout has always looked back to the kind of the 1950s World of Tomorrow. We were looking at that late 50s, early 60s kind of Rat Pack vibe. Bugsy Siegel, the I guess you could say the father of Las Vegas in some ways, as being the kind of exemplar of its mobbed up past. And also Howard Hughes, who presided over a very peculiar chapter of Vegas's history when he spent 4 years in a 250 square foot hotel room. And I think managed to spend $400 million, which was an astronomical sum, just on the telephone. I mean, who knows what he would have done if he'd had internet access. So, and then also other things were taking a look at the trajectory of the city, really from its very distant past as just kind of a dusty den of iniquity, but also into its Glitter Gulch era, where it was sort of kicking off, which I think is echoed in a portion of our game that you can visit that's called Freeside, to its current Disneyfied resort kind of vibe, family-friendly vibe, which in some ways is also echoed in the strip itself that you'll be visiting when the game is out. So all of that I've just paid attention to give an example of the amount of sort of the absorption phase of pre-production, which I think is extraordinarily important to just immerse yourself in the world that you're creating. But then, of course, the rubber hits the road, and the next step is to begin writing. And in this case, the target document that we have at Obsidian is called the story brief. And I'm going to go ahead and this is actually the very first draft of the story brief. And the main thing that I would have you notice is it's really just a big bullet point list with some images occasionally thrown in. It's kind of like a big regurgitation of ideas for people to go ahead and take a look at. It goes into a fair amount of detail, but it's not really all that carefully organized. And the other thing that's most important, really the thing that's most important, is you'll notice the profuse comments. Because one of the things that we do at Obsidian is that when you go ahead and you put one of these things together, it gets just commented up the wazoo. And that's actually a fantastic thing because at the studio we have a real concentration of writing talent. And it's something that we take very seriously. So you'll have this kind of pile-on effect that will occur. And that is what will end up guiding, of course, all of the revisions that are going to be taking place. And then that, of course, brings us to the next step, which is rewriting. And this might as well be called steps 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I mean, how many, I don't know, even know how many how many steps to go through with that. Now, while this is going on, of course, you can't take an infinitely long period of time to develop your story. It is very important to take time to develop it because when you're working on an open world title like this, you want to make your mistakes early and catch them early. But there was also other writing that was going on during this phase. And if you're working on a title of this sort, I think a great way to spend other writing time is to be developing content that is off the critical path. So you're developing the critical path in kind of an extended pre-production mode, but you are familiarizing yourself with the tools and the writing of the game by creating pockets of side quest content. I think that was very beneficial for the area designers, and it was certainly very beneficial also for creative design or narrative design on the title. By this time, if we instead now take a look at the this is the sort of final and fifth draft of the story brief document. And now what you'll see is this has a table of contents. And it is a much more organized and kind of mature document. It has a timeline of important events, that sort of stuff. And this is, let's see here. So the other thing that's very important about the document at this point is that there's also been the emergence of themes. So I want to let's go ahead and pay some special attention to that. One of the things that we end up defining about the games that we work on at Obsidian is the themes of the game. I think it's good not to do this too early. I think it's best to go ahead and do it later on as you've already started to develop some of the story and you know what sort of story you're telling and you know the world that you're setting it in. In this case, these were fairly obvious to sort of grab for. One of them was just greed. That is what Las Vegas is. It's an exemplar of greed. But the other thing was also we very much tried to stay away from for example, from the theme of luck, because Vegas isn't about luck. Vegas is entirely about having a rigged game. And so those were two. And another one that emerged as we were working on the title was a theme of recreating the old world. This is actually something that's been endemic to the franchise from very early on. But as we were taking a look at the different factions and the main competing factions in the game, we realized that they were all involved in that process of trying to recreate older versions of the world. In terms of actually implementing those, the importance of themes is that they can help guide the creation of content across a bunch of disciplines. And they also then, I think that leads to a more coherent work. You should try, I believe, to eschew having more than 2 or 3 themes at the most, so that it doesn't become too complicated. The other thing is, try to seek ways not just to inflict the themes on the player by having NPCs who are involved in these themes, but try to frame the choices that the NPC is given, that the player is given, so that the player is directly participating in these themes. And then once that is settled, the next thing is to start fleshing out the world. Now, I think that actually, in this instance, it would be different if we were starting fresh with an IP. If we were creating a completely new IP, I think it would actually be the opposite. What you would want to do is to begin by creating the world and the people in it, and then starting to look at what sort of stories you might be able to set in that world. But in this case, the Fallout universe was already established, and this was a new installment. We were really just creating a new portion or a new location in that. And so we did the story first in this case, and then began to flesh it out. So in this case, an example document would be a faction profile, the New California Republic, which might be familiar to some of you who've played the games. If you take a look at this, it talks about the goals, the history of it, a number of important dates. Having a little bit of mouse difficulty here, sorry. And then also breaks down the culture of this faction, its attitudes towards the other factions, and other cultural aspects. This is all things that is very helpful in terms of writing characters for this faction as the writing process goes on. And then next, defining dialogue standards. At Obsidian, it is a standard part of the process to have a dialogue standards document that is very detailed. It actually lists how to punctuate in the game. I mean, it defines things down to that level. This seems really boring, and it's not really what you get into narrative design to do. You know what else seems really boring? A parachute when you're packing it. Seems pretty boring. But it takes on a really exciting dimension when it opens and stops you from plummeting to your death. And if you are organizing a huge team project, it becomes even more important. So the dialogue standards document, if we just take a look through this table of contents, has a number of dialogue benchmarks in terms of what it is that we're going to be trying to do with the dialogue. And as I was mentioning, it drills down into really great, really fine, precise detail about punctuation, about the use of dashes and ellipses. Again, these are things that don't seem exciting, but when you have 9 people who are all involved in writing the game, then you need to have these sorts of standards. And I would just say if you ignore this, you do so at your peril. Our game also has a lot of special cases in terms of the way that the dialogue was implemented, things having to do with ability checks. We were doing these differently than Fallout 3. Again, a lot of information on the limits of expressiveness. We have a lot of pop-up text. We have all these other things that are very important to account for. And if we just kind of go down to this is, I think, something that will kind of make this point. Well, actually, that's right. I can make this point a little more dramatically. Let's go ahead and have a standards here. I think I've already convinced some of you that this is important, but let's go ahead and have a little test. How many of you played Fallout 3? Okay, a fair number of you. Okay, so you all of you then know what the stim pack is. The stim pack is something, well, you would know this if you played the first two. The stim pack is what you use to heal yourself. So of these, how do you spell that? What is the correct way to spell it? Sorry? C. Okay, we have one vote for C. How many people think it's A? No one thinks it's A. How many people think it's B? One person. Two. C, we have, okay, about 4, 5, 6, 7.
If you were paying attention, I shook my head when he said C.
D, one person, and E. Okay, most people think it's E, which is pretty good because that's the closest, but it's a trick question because it has to be capitalized. So that's exactly what I'm talking about, because if you have 9 people, 9 well-meaning, hard-working narrative designers who can't get that right, and don't even get me started on Vault-Tec. Oh, excuse me, I think that's Vault. No, I'm pretty sure that's right. So yeah, that's what this is all about. This, setting up the standard abbreviations, because not everybody is necessarily going to know how to abbreviate the luck attribute when they're doing a dialogue check, or how to abbreviate different skills in the game, or all of these other gameplay elements that can appear in game text. And oh my God, you need to have spelling conventions, because you will have all sorts of ways that people spell all right, or anyways, all of these other things. And all of this just has to be defined in a document exactly like this. It's not especially exciting, but it will save your ass. And then next, defining global variables. This is, when you have a game of this sort, an open world game where a ton of things can happen, and it can happen all over the place, and you want to be able to have dialogue that reacts to this. What you don't want to have happen is have the variables that are checked be consigned to specific discrete locations, because then it becomes very difficult to remember what sort of prefix or terminology you're going to find in order to have this checked. You're always going to be running over and trying to figure out which area designer was involved in setting up that variable, that kind of thing. So what you want to do is you want to set up a list, a defined list of dialogue, of global variables. Sorry. Which is here. And as you'll see, we had a ton of these. So we've gone ahead and the game, even though it is not really a linear game, does have a kind of 3-act structure that does go ahead and feature a rising tension. And in this case, what we did is we assigned what we called story states. And that was something that we could check for kind of globally. But then there are also just all of these discrete events, just a ton of discrete events that we are checking, and they can be referenced in any dialogue anywhere. And you need to have a central repository for those, or you will suffer and you will cry.
Spoiler alert.
Yeah, I was trying to get away from that before it was too late. And so once you have done that, you have to just get into writing and writing and writing. So the process that this is used it varies from individual to individual. In the case of Eric and Travis, they wrote their material independently. They used their own process. One of the things that I would recommend personally using for major NPCs, people like quest givers for factions, is to just put together a dialogue plan. In this case, this is the dialogue plan for Caesar, or Kaiser as he calls himself, who is the leader of Caesar's Legion. This goes ahead and it specifies which skills and perks the player will be able to use. It references all those story states. I'm trying to go fast enough that you can't actually see what it says. And then it just breaks down a whole ton of different conditions under which the player can go ahead and meet this character. If you have something like this, you're going to have a much easier time when it gets around to actually sitting down and using the conversation editor. And one other thing is that we also have area designers, unlike Travis or Eric, who don't really have an interest in writing. And in that case, what you're doing as a creative designer or as a writer is you're collaborating with those people as they're implementing quest content. And that can be tricky because there's a lot of things that need to be implemented in order to do that. So one of the things that we developed was a process for what we call stubbing dialogue. And this is something that I would recommend that you use if you find yourself in this type of situation. So one of the things that we were able to do is that if you have an editor, you can open it up, you can actually place the NPCs, even if you're just going to go ahead and place them all in one place. Then another thing that we have is what we would call a temp script man, or I think that you actually created this, didn't you, Eric?
No.
The use of this?
I can't claim credit for that.
Okay. But it's basically just a person, just like a dummy that you can walk up to and you can say, hey, I want to go ahead and make this event happen. And then just activates that script so you can test the dialogue. And then the area designer will also create a very bare bones structure for conversations that just will cover what sort of events can occur. The idea is to keep this very, very, again, very bare bones. You don't want the area designer to waste time trying to actually write dialogue, just to give a kind of hint to the content that will later be created. And so, as with all of our documents, we try to be very precise with giving examples about how precisely to do that. This, I think, really eases the collaboration process as it goes forward. So that's pretty much straight through the process. I mean, obviously, when we're looking at the dialogue editor itself, which is where all of the work takes place, but those are the supporting documents that really take you from the very beginning of kind of the inspiration stage right through to the production phase. And so in conclusion, I think it's very difficult to survive an apocalypse, but if you prepare well and have the correct equipment, I think it can be done. So I hope that some of the things I've talked about today will inspire those sorts of solutions for you. And I think at that point we can go ahead and just open this up to questions and discussion. Yes.
How long was your research phase? How long did you spend in the inspiration work?
I would say that the research started in February and really continued on through the revision process of the game. So it's kind of a rolling process. So I'd say that it probably wasn't wrapped up until about the following, maybe May or June. I mean, I think of course, it continued on into devising faction profiles as well, because that would sort of spark a whole new phase of research and inspiration as you're starting to, you decide that one faction is sort of reminiscent of outlaw motorcycle groups, so then you go ahead and start taking a look at materials about that, and it's sort of an ongoing process. Yes.
I had a question about, when you create a story and then it goes into design and production, obviously things change. Things don't work out as well as you want to, like a big moment in the design. Can you kind of talk about the back and forth you had between, writing and design and production, and how you guys kind of influence each other and come into that creative process?
I think that it'd be great to have Eric and Travis answer that question, because they were actually doing both sides of the process.
Oh God, the pressure.
But yeah, I mean, like you said, obviously things change a lot throughout the course of a project. We try to make them change as little as possible. There was pretty constant communication. I mean, at Obsidian, the creative team is considered part of the design team. So we kind of basically divide the design team into area design, system design, and creative design. And so when we have design team meetings, all of those people are there, which makes for some pretty lengthy weekly update meetings, but it also keeps everybody on the same page. Generally, everybody knows as soon as there's a change in the story that's going to impact their areas, they know why the change is being made. So it's not just like you're getting an email from production one day that says, hey, guess what? All the stuff that you did last week, it's gone. So there's a lot more understanding, and I think that really helps to keep everybody on the same page, keep everybody collaborating well, and keep the engine rolling as smoothly as we can.
We definitely emphasize just trying to get people out of their desk chairs and going up and talking interfacing with the designers they need to be interfacing with. Like, John filled in a lot of stub dialogue for a lot of different designers, and he needed to be up constantly, making sure everything had been implemented, following up, making sure he had what he needed to continue working at the same time.
Yes.
So, as a games editor, I want to say I'm in love with your document standards document. Dialogue standards document. I often work with teams that aren't used to so much structure. Did you persuading people that this was a good thing to use? And if so, how did you deal with that?
The cattle prods helped.
Yeah,
I can buy a cattle.
it's handy when you can send somebody an email that has a hyperlink to the document. I mean, that's actually one way to just keep on. You do, I think, have to keep on bringing it up and sort of creating awareness about the document, because people get very busy and people don't really walk in the morning thinking, I hope I get a chance to check that dialogue standards document today to make sure that I'm spelling all right correctly. You know what I mean? That's not what's going to happen. So, but it is a matter of just continually bringing up that there is this repository for standards. And I think over time that it did gain momentum, because especially at the end when we were trying to do a lot of text lock and people were trying to make sure that everything was consistent, it got a lot more use.
To add to that, we've had a version of that document, I think, for every project we've had at Obsidian. So in one form or another, it evolves, and the Knights of the Old Republic has its own set of words like Stimpack that you have to memorize. And so it is part of the company culture that's expected early in the project. You read the document, that sort of thing. And you still run into problems where people haven't read the document. And for cases like that, one of the best things, I would say hands down the best thing about the tool set, the Garden of Eden Creation Kit tool set, is it has a very generic word find tool. So if you're looking for things like, if you just look for common misspellings of Stimpack, you can find them anywhere in the project where they've been written across, we have, 65,000 lines of dialogue or so in the game. And you can find it anywhere and correct it across the board.
As a follow-up to your questions, so documents change. How do you keep track of the changes? You can read the guide at the beginning, but do you alert people? It's like, oh, we changed this, or how do you? Because I think that's the most difficult part. Even when you're working with project documenting your process, if something changes in the guide of whatever kind, how do you tell people, hey?
I think that you're correct. I mean, part of it is an alert process, but the other thing is some of the documents, their changes are a matter of iteration, and the changes are pretty significant. I think the story overview is probably the clearest example of that. In terms of the dialogue standards document, every single time that there was a new element, there was a team-wide email that went out to let people know that was being added. So I think that was fairly straightforward.
One tool we found at TCP that was very useful, we had lots of outsourcers back in the right with publishing. People wouldn't always follow documents, so we actually constructed a custom word dictionary that you could import in, so it automatically detects those words. Because we have a similar lengthy lexicon, and so it's much easier to kind of just say, check on those in this dictionary, and that autocorrects a lot of things. But one problem we ran into is, as we're looking towards regionalizing our text, is finding where we draw the line between our lexicon and translation. I don't know if you guys addressed our regional standards at all, like for languages?
Thankfully, I was not especially involved in the localization of Fallout New Vegas. Yeah, with 65,000 lines of dialogue, I can't actually speak to how that happened with localization. We did sort of within the text editor, we did create a custom dictionary that would track kind of idiosyncratic terms or that we had. Stephen, I think you had a question earlier. Are you implying that I have presented an ideal vision of how this should work, Stephen? I would say that actually the challenge has had more to do with. I'm curious to know what you would think as well. I think that the challenge has had more to do with going back and rewriting and catching everything for consistency. But by that time, that was content that was already in the editor. So at that point, we were working with those tool sets. And other than that, we mostly manage everything through SharePoint. And just being able to have a place. Every document, basically, a document was treated as not existing if it wasn't on SharePoint. And so that's where the latest versions were available.
We did have somebody go through the entire script and edit the whole thing for consistency at one point.
We haven't heard from that person in 2 or 3 months. I don't know what happened to them. Yeah. Yes.
I noticed you said there was something there about no accents written in dialogue.
Right.
I was wondering if you could talk. Because this is like a contentious one with some people in writing. It's like, do you write accents?
I think
I don't like it so much, but it seems like.
if you're going to write accents, it's one thing if you're making some particular word choices or maybe even looking at your sentence structure to impart or enable a certain rhythm. But it's very annoying if all of the words that a French person says is written Z, Z-E. I mean, that's just going to be annoying to read.
Remember that in Harry Potter, guys? Terrible.
What advice would you give to people? I know I've spoken to some people in localization who feel that makes dialogue more interesting, or that it's great, and that your dialogue boring unless it sounds like we're in a Rocky and Bullwinkle.
It would be to include direction for the actor to use a French accent, and for the director to have the actor use a French accent. I think that's much better than saddling or burdening the actual text that we'll display on screen with that. I think you believe that very strongly, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have the benefit now that we didn't have, back when Fallout 1 and 2 were out, we have voiceover for the full game, and it's a matter. And don't get me wrong, it's very important not to drop the ball. It's very important to make sure that the voice director knows to direct the actor to speak with this specific accent. But the rule of thumb that I've heard for writing accents, the one I like the best, is that you just write in such a way that you don't ever get in the way of the reader's ability to read the text. You write the diction, especially, is especially important. Occasionally, if there's a word that's so weird that it wouldn't make sense to write it normally, you can do that. You can put an apostrophe here or there, but it's best to let the reader read as smoothly as possible, let the voice actor convey the accent you're trying to convey.
Another thing which isn't really relevant to the issue of localization, but certainly for the English language version, is that at Obsidian, the standard practice is that the person who wrote a character, and we tend to break down writing assignments on the basis of character, that creative designer will be present during the voiceover recording for that character. So that covers a lot of the performance and accent issues.
The only thing I would add about accents is when writing accents, it is great to just put that little note that says this character speaks with a French accent. Bear in mind how many voice actors can actually do a convincing French accent before you load up your game with the equivalent of the United Nations. That's all I'm going to say.
Yes.
With Fallout has such a large fictional history attached to it, including all the games. I think there's a book. I'm thinking there's a book of the history. I can't remember.
You might be thinking of the Fallout Bible?
Yes.
Yeah. It was actually a sort of a huge Bible that was maintained by Chris Avalon, who's the lead creative officer, the chief creative officer at Obsidian Entertainment.
Right. I mean, it's basically WikiWord. There is one. But when you're writing like a new chapter for the game, do you try to keep it as cognizant to that timeline and all the historical facts, or do you allow for some retconning, or do you try to keep it as self-contained so you're not stepping on specific toes of history?
Very much staying conscious of what's been established beforehand. I mean, I think that the Fallout Bible had some information or dates that were that extended into the initial Fallout 3 or Van Buren project, which wasn't completed, and so those weren't looked at as being canon. But anything that had been firmly established, we took great pains to respect. Yes. Could you clarify that question a little bit more?
Like say for instance, if I was referencing like Fallout 3, like if you had a writer designer taking care of Oasis, and then you have to shift team things around,
I think that the assignments were pretty consistent. We did have some areas that we went back and revisited and did another kind of revision pass where different staff were then assigned to that. But those were staff who then worked with the previous area designer to maintain consistency. I mean, both of you, I think, were involved in those processes.
Yeah.
Yeah, we were fortunate, honestly, in the consistency of staffing. You know, obviously you can get a wrench thrown in the whole process if a designer leaves the project and some other designer has to come in and try to consistently write in the stead of the previous designer. But like I said, we had people kind of go through the whole script looking for consistency issues, and it's creatively's job to look over everybody's shoulder, make sure that everybody's kind of on the same page with how they're writing, how they're doing their tone.
How did you get people to read?
Again, the cattle prods help.
What did you say?
Again, the cattle prods help.
The cattle prods help, yeah. The team structure, the team actually grew quite a bit. I don't know, how many, do we end up having about 45 towards the end?
Yeah.
Which still isn't huge by today's standards.
But I guess the bulk of the makeup was designers on this project.
Yeah, we had the benefit of an established tool set. So there were still, of course, a lot of new assets to create, but we weren't starting off from scratch in that way. We had a project lead who was also the lead designer on the project, Josh Sawyer, and then a number of area designers and who were attached to the project. In terms of the actual structure, well, I think everyone on the project was involved in storytelling, but the number of people who actually wrote for the game would be a total of, who did writing for the game were a total of about 9 people. The people who actually did, I'd say, like major chunks of writing was more like 4 or 5 people. And then the others were area designers who did additional dialogue for their areas.
We only had maybe, I'm going to say 2 dedicated writers. It's you and Chris Avalone, yeah.
Well, on this project, yeah.
On this project, and everybody else is handling. They might be mixing that in with level design duties. Usually, is how we handled that. So it was kind of people filling in writing where it needed to be done. It was kind of an on-demand process.
And the level designing, we're talking about like area design is also quest design, so it's very narrative rich. I mean, the work that they're doing, it goes hand in hand with writing very, very easily. Yes.
I keep hearing about dinosaur sniper vision.
Oh yeah.
What was the inspiration behind that? Was that just something that came up, or did you plan it from the start?
Eric might know a little something about this.
Oh, that's my quest. It came out of a meeting where we had gotten together early on in the project to talk about we were developing sort of a first area as a prototype for the rest of the project. And we got all the level designers together in one room just to talk about the kind of quests we wanted to have in the area. And one of our designers, Jesse Farrell, said it would be really cool. So it started with Josh Sawyer said he wanted there to be the big dinosaurs like Pee-wee's Big Adventure, the big dinosaurs. He wanted to see that as the landmark for this particular level, and he wanted there to be snipers in there. He wanted there to be 2 snipers, and he wanted them to rotate, shifts. And then another designer said it would be really cool if one of the designers, if one of the snipers had been wronged horribly by the other. And that ended up, I ended up just kind of taking that one and running with it. So that idea bounced off like three people before we had a coherent quest out of it.
And again, it goes back to that do your research because you will find much, much cooler things in real life than a lot of people will be able to think of. Because there is actually, if I'm not mistaken, a giant dinosaur somewhere in the desert.
California.
It's actually in California. We moved it to Nevada. But yeah, like you find things like that, and it's just, it has to go in a game because it's just so cool.
How would you separate out the workload? Decide which writers got which writing
Well, part of it was just survival, wanting to spread out the workload in a fairly even area. But a lot of it was on the basis of area design. The area, whoever was building the area would also do the writing, or at least rough out the writing for that area.
John sort of handled the main spine of the story, and then it was to the level designers to fill in specific characters for an area, usually if they weren't pertinent to the critical path storyline. John handled all the critical path stuff.
Any other questions? I don't know. How are we doing on time, actually? Is it time
for...
for...
We have a little time, but it's also going to lunch, and there's a lot of stuff going on at lunch, so if we want to end it a little early.
Yeah, okay. Any final questions? Okay, great.
Okay, let me, first, big round of applause. It's, I assume you guys feel the same way. It's such an incredible pleasure to be able to listen to guys like you talk about a game that hasn't come out yet, but is about to. Like that's like we don't usually, things don't usually line up that way time-wise. Usually you're hearing talking about things that they've already done that everybody's played and experienced. And so for me, this is really whetting my appetite in a big way. And there must be something in the water at Obsidian, because you guys are also nice. I don't know how that happens. Anyway, quickly to remind you, poster session at noon down the hall. The ladies from MIT will be discussing interactive fiction also in the hall. And after lunch, Kevin Brooks, Head Games, The Power of Traditional Storytelling in New Platforms in this room, and the New Writers Q&A session in room 7. Don't forget, please, to tweet, to post on Facebook, to blog about the things you're seeing, the things you're hearing, the things you're learning, the people you're meeting, the things you're experiencing, the beers you're drinking, all of that stuff. And thanks very much for coming. Have a great lunch. Oh, man. Oh, yeah. I mean, it's so funny to me that that's a changed presentation. That was fantastic.
I'm glad that you liked it.
Oh, yeah.
You didn't end up changing a whole lot, did you? Did you end up changing a whole lot of the presentation?
Yeah, I would think so from what he said, yeah.
I mean, there was a little bit of overlap with Comic-Con, but that was pretty much all managed. Wow. And unfortunately, when I was practicing, it was a lot easier to alt-tab.
Hey, how's it going?
No, you're fine.
Sorry about last night, but I was really brain dead.
No worries. Yeah, I called it a pretty early night myself. I think dinner at the Spaghetti Warehouse did not agree with me. So avoid that place would be my recommendation.
A lot of their job is...
We were debating creating a photo chat.
Cool. I was trying to think in terms of...
Hi.
It's interesting that it seems like you talk
your car?
that sounds really familiar, a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, well, when it works, it works. Yeah. You find it in a lot of places.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
I think,
But you mean indie, or you mean
good to get it out there and discuss it, because you never know when somebody else is going to have it. Absolutely. Thank you.
Sure, yeah. Sure.
That's one thing we did recently was all of our infamous pronunciation issues.
Oh,
yeah, cool.
Is Russell and I just sat down and audio recording.
Yeah, right.
And we have it on our wiki now, so that way if people are acting or
we actually did on Dungeon Siege. It was really cool. Our dialogue tool now, as part of like people are saying, have a custom dictionary with all of your unique words. Our custom dictionary and our dialogue tool for Dungeon Siege also includes a pronunciation guide. So when we export that dialogue out for the voice actors, it just automatically brackets it in, puts it into a format that will not be read by the game, it won't ever show up in the game. That way you don't have to worry about, one designer thinks the syllable root should be spelled R-U-K-E, and one thinks it should be R-U-H-K, and one thinks it's R-O-O-K.
Yeah.
So we just have you type the word, and then that way also you don't have to worry about remembering to put it in, because you get into the flow of writing, and it can be easy to forget. Oh yeah, this voice actor in this dialogue has this pronunciation note yet. So yeah, we automated
I'm really glad that you enjoyed it. Thanks.
Yeah, that's something that I'm sure.
Yeah, I hope that nobody caught anything.